So let's just kind of quickly review maybe a little bit of what we've been covering. So, we're concerned with the American Revolution. Right, and the American Revolution is the process by which 13 colonies break away from Great Britain and become the United States. Chapter 4 was all about the causes, right? What caused the war. Chapter 5 was mostly about the war itself and the impact or consequences of the war. Chapter 5 talked a little bit about the immediate aftermath, right, of the war. And in that chapter, one of the immediate aftermaths, you might say, was the creation of a national government. Again, we have a brand new country here, right? The United States is a brand new country. There needs to be some sort of system of government. And what the Second Continental Congress created, essentially, was a government called the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation was the first government of the United States. However, the Articles had many, many problems, and some of them are illustrated by what you see in this picture here, or these pictures, I should say. And this is a currency from all the different states. So under the Articles period, because states had more or less sovereign power, states were really where much of the power was held, not at the national level. Each state more or less had the right to create their own economic laws and policies. And so you can see the state of Virginia issuing their own currency, the state of Rhode Island issuing their currency. Here's a dollar from New Hampshire. And we outlined a lot of the specific issues that the Articles had. If we were to sum it up, we would say that the Articles was too weak to function. And so advocates who wanted to reform included people like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison. We might also add to this George Washington. Said, we need to do something about this government. It's, if we keep going on this trajectory, the inability to pay down war debt, the inability to put down uprisings like Shays Rebellion, the inability to regulate the economy, to tax. If the country keeps going down this path, the United States is going to cease to exist, right? The great experiment in liberty will be over very quickly. So instead, what happened was that these reformers got together. Sometimes we refer to them as the New Nationalists. And said, let's hold a constitutional convention, invite the representatives from all the states. And essentially, initially, it was designed to edit the Articles. Let's just make a couple of changes so that we can take care of issues like paying down the war debt. However, editing turned into just a process of writing a new constitution. All right, and that's exactly what they did. And so in 1787 was when the Constitutional Convention was convened. The Founding Fathers, again, is just the term for and at the beginning there were 55 people who were all men, many of them very wealthy, many of them very educated, and many of them having a background in the military, right? So we're talking about a specific class of people, 55 people from this class, right? Wealthy, educated, having military experience, would sit and argue and debate about what the new national government would look like. And as you might imagine, in that debate, there were going to be a lot of different perspectives and ideas that were put forward. notable people that were there: Hamilton, Madison, Washington, Benjamin Franklin was there. They were all part of this important process. One of the biggest debates, though, and what divided the convention, probably more than anything else, was this issue about representation. Right, issue of representation. That is, when it comes to laws, how would states vote? Now, if you remember, under the Articles of Confederation period, it was one state equals one vote. But this caused a disagreement between the big states on the one hand, and what we mean by big is large population, and the small states. The big states were not a big fan of this, right? And the idea was because, well, since they had a much bigger population, shouldn't they get more votes? Whereas small states were in favor of this version of it. And this disagreement between the big states and the small states manifested itself in two different plans that were proposed at the Constitutional Convention. The Virginia Plan, from the state of Virginia and supported by the other big states, said that in terms of representation, population should determine how many votes a state gets. The New Jersey Plan, which was supported by the smaller states, said essentially one state equals one vote. And again, this would be something that the big states on the one hand would pick one side, the small states on the other would pick another one, and the two seem to be interlocked in a debate about it. Another big divide, I might say, was over the issue of slavery. Now, on the issue of slavery, there was no talk about abolishing slavery, but the question about slavery was, how does it factor in representation? Right? In other words, do slaves count? If the population is going to determine how many votes a state gets, well, then do the slaves count towards that? In this area, the divide was different. It was between North and South. Again, for the purposes of voting, the North would say, no, slaves shouldn't count, because if slaves were counted in the overall population, the Southern states would have more political power. Southern states insisted that, yes, slaves should be counted for the purposes of representation. So it's important to understand that when we talk about the disagreement over slavery at the Constitutional Convention, it wasn't a debate about whether or not slavery should continue to be legal. It was a debate about whether or not slavery should be, or slaves should be counted as part of the part of representation, right? That was the idea. Now, there were also many other issues that, of course, were at the convention, but eventually the delegates made compromises, right? In regards to representation, maybe I'll go ahead and use a different color here to mark this. In regards to representation, right, the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan, those two sides got their issue resolved, you might say, with the Great Compromise, which set up a two-house legislature, right? Legislative or legislature is simply just a law-passing body or Congress. So two houses, one to be called the House of Representatives and one to be called the Senate. In the House of Representatives, states are represented by their population. Right? So that was where the Virginia Plan went out. In the Senate, every single state gets 2 votes, regardless of how big or small it was. And in order for a bill, right, which is a proposal, to become a law, it has to pass both houses, right? So both had to agree in order for the law to be passed. That's why we have our system of government that we have today, right? This Constitution that was written at the convention back from 1787 through 1789 is still our current Constitution today. So that's why we have it. And so, for example, the states with very big populations benefit greatly from the House of Representatives. So just for example, today, there are 435 members of the House of Representatives. California is about 54 or 55 of those votes. So a lot of those votes come from California. That's just because we have such a big population, right? We'll say Cali. Whereas you look at a place like Alaska, right, in the House of Representatives, Alaska only has one vote, and that's because they're such a small state in terms of population. Whereas in the Senate, California and Alaska both get 2 votes. So in terms of getting this issue of representation solved, this is why we call it the Great Compromise, because for the most part, the big states and the small states could come to an agreement. Now, another compromise had to be over the issue of slavery, right? And let me make sure I'm not jumping the gun here, because I don't think that, it's not talked about down here. It's not listed in here, but I do want to mention it. And the compromise, which was created in terms of slavery, was the 3/5 compromise, which simply stated, again, if we look up here, do slaves count towards representation? The North said no, South said yes. The two sides came together and said, well, how about if we count slaves simply as 3/5 of the population, which essentially stated, let's say Virginia had, let's say Virginia in theory had 5,000 slaves. Well, when you count the population of Virginia, you would simply just add 3,000 to that. And that would give Virginia a little bit bigger of a population and would give them more votes then in the House of Representatives. So one thing that the 3/5 compromise did was it increased the political power of slave states, right? Increased the political power of the slave states, something that the North would come to resent for a very long time. And, with that, even though there was compromise, and again, a compromise is something that, neither side really wants. I mean, in the case of big and small or North and South, but they're kind of willing to cede the territory in order to make it work. With that being said, one of the largest unresolved issues, I mean, there were many. So for example, where would Native Americans fit into this entire category? There was unresolved issues over specifically the extent of power of the new national government. Let's go ahead and say for this, probably the biggest unresolved issue was what we might call a lack of restraint on the national government. That is to say, if we look at the 55 people who created this document, all of them more or less were in favor of giving more power to the national government. But the Founding Fathers had to kind of do this tricky balancing act, and that was to create, on the one hand, a government that was powerful enough to function, right? So it needed to function, needed to work, but it couldn't go too far into tyranny, right? Creating a government so strong that it would simply crush the rights of its citizens, or at least have the possibility to crush the rights for their citizens. Because the idea of creating a constitution is so that it can, it could live beyond everybody who wrote it, right? That it's sort of a structure for how the government should work. And it should have protections in it that not just prevent the current, leaders in the US government from being or having the capabilities of being tyrannical, but it also should prevent future generations from doing that. But at the same time, powerful enough to function, to pay down the war debt, to fight wars against other countries, et cetera, et cetera. And so I would say that probably one of the biggest unresolved issues at the convention was to what extent should there be some restraint on the national government. And so when it was all said and done, the Constitution of 1787, ratified in 1789, gave us essentially what our current governmental structure is. And just a kind of a brief lesson in terms of like civics, the Constitution created 3 branches of government: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. If we were to pinpoint one person as being the most responsible for the Constitution, it would be James Madison, who you see pictured right here. We would call him maybe the father of the Constitution. Of course, it was a group project, right? Representatives from all the states helped to do it. But again, if we had to say just one person was responsible for it, we'd probably say James Madison had the biggest influence. And the system and structure for which this document created is incredibly important in understanding, because it provides a point of reference for all of American history that follows, right? If you understand the way that the Constitution is set up, you're going to have a much easier time understanding a lot of American history after the Constitution. So a couple of very kind of key points that we should take note of. One is this idea of federalism. So the Constitution set up a federalist style of government. That is to say, there is a division of power, maybe not separation because we don't want to get too confused, but a division of power between the national government. And again, this would be the government of the whole United States, and the governments at the state level, right? State governments. So for example, today, there's a government in California, there's a government on the national level, and the two kind of go back and forth in terms of distributing power between the both of them. And that's what the Constitution set up. So for example, when it comes to the power to declare war, the national government can do that, right? Can California declare war against Japan? Actually, no, it can't. It's illegal, right? California was not granted that power by the Constitution to declare war. We can't declare war on Arizona, right? Or something like that. When it comes to something like voting, right? Voting historically in the United States has been mostly on the state level, right? States get to decide their own voting laws. When it comes to things like taxes, and guess what? This is coming up right around the corner. Both the national and state governments can do that, right? And if you are, if you're in a position where you have to pay taxes or have in the past, well, this all too well, right? Both these things can have the ability to tax you. So again, federalism is a system in which there's a national and local power. Power is delegated to each side, and sometimes there are also shared powers between the two of them, right? And we'll talk a lot about the conflicts between states and the federal government. On the other hand, there's also what we call a separation of powers, which is different. The separation of powers and checks and balances, these are kind of the same thing, is referring to this system up here. Right, so it says that within the national government, so just in the national government, there is an executive branch, which is the president. There's a judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court. And there's a legislative branch, which is Congress. And each of these branches have the power to check and balance one another. So for example, when it comes to making laws, the laws are voted on in Congress. They're signed by the executive. They're interpreted by the judicial branch. Another good example of this is the power of impeachment, right? To remove somebody from office. The founders created the process of impeachment to make sure that nobody in the executive or the judicial branch could abuse their power, that the legislative branch has a check on these other two branches. So that's what separation of powers and checks and balances refers to. It's only within this national framework that we're referring to, whereas federalism is the division of power between the national and state governments. Any questions about those two ideas? They're pretty important concepts. Okay, so it looks like we're good then. So we could certainly say about the Constitution that it created a more, like I mentioned earlier, powerful government. However, we also have to understand, and this was the balance that the founders wanted to strike, was to create a government that was powerful, but not so powerful that it was tyrannical. And that is to say that one of the maybe reservations that the founders had was having a government that was too democratic, something called the tyranny of the people. And we might call this excess democracy. Now you might think to yourself, how can something like democracy be in excess? Isn't democracy a good thing, right? The more democratic, the better. We might also refer to this as tyranny of the majority. And that is to say, not always, right? And in creating this new national government, it had to be by the people, which you see the first three words of the US Constitution saying, we the people. It needs to be democratic so that it belongs to the people, but not so democratic that it leads to what they might call anarchy or chaos, right? And that only selected individuals should be able to participate in this governmental process. So when you actually look at the Constitution itself, we could say that it's really, in some cases, not that democratic, right? Certainly by today's standards. For the standards of the time, we have to keep in mind this is the most democratic and revolutionary document that's really ever been written on politics. We're talking about thousands of years of governments ruled by kings and queens and religion and all those other things. So for its time, it is radically democratic. By today's standards, it's not. Because when you break down these three branches, it's only the legislative branch and only one part of the legislative branch that is directly elected, and that is the House. Members of the Senate were chosen by state governments, the president, and this is a lesson that some of us know from, I guess, what is it now, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, whatever it was. The person with the most votes does not become the president. It's instead decided by the Electoral College, which was kind of a safeguard against democracy in some way, to make sure that the masses aren't choosing the executive, but rather these electors, which were chosen by state representatives in those days. And the judicial branch of the Supreme Court is appointed by the president. So only one part of this Constitution was actually purely democratic. The idea was to get people who are more well-versed, invested, learned, knowledgeable, educated in charge. According to many of the founding fathers, if you just let everyday people vote, they would make the wrong choice, right? This kind of goes back to this Enlightenment idea and whether or not democracy is a viable alternative, right? People like John Locke said that people were generally good and that more democracy is essentially better. But then you had other people that said, no, people are generally not good. They're dumb. They're ill-informed. It's chaos, right? And so where to find that proper balance? And so that's where we get, maybe that's what we'll call the limited democracy here, right? That only one branch of one part of one branch actually had the ability to vote. But one thing that we should take note of, and we're going to use Sally Hemings as an example, is the contradiction between the rhetoric and the practice of not just the U.S. Constitution, but a lot of the principles that were instilled in it and that are evident in it. Sally Hemings was a slave and maybe we'll call a mistress to Thomas Jefferson, which she fathered Jefferson's children, but remained a slave. And Jefferson especially, if we really want to look at one historical figure who best represents this contradiction, on the one hand, talking about American values like liberty and freedom and sovereignty, but at the same time holding people in bondage via slavery, Jefferson is probably the best illustration of this. Not only, the story of Sally Hemings, for whom he had a number of children with, but he also was a slave owner of over 200 slaves. And unlike George Washington, who manumitted his slaves after his death, Thomas Jefferson chose not to do that. And that is to say, just in general about the Constitution itself, it is relatively brief. It is pretty vague in terms of some of the language. Even, for example, slaves were not referred to as slaves. Slaves were referred to as, quote unquote, other peoples, right? So the Constitution identifies three groups of people, quote unquote, the people, other peoples, which was clear that slaves were not part of this new great experiment, and then Native Americans. And those are the only groups that are referred to. But there's a lot of vague language, right? It's not particular. In the Constitution, there are some things that are very specific, right? So for example, the president serves for 4 years, right? That's very specific. In order to be the president, you need to be born in the US and you need to be, I think it's 35 years old, I think is the age. I may be wrong about that. So those things are very, very, very particular. But then there are other things in it that are very vague. So for example, the Constitution gives the US government the power to essentially look after the general welfare of the people, right? General welfare. It's like that, what does general welfare mean? Well, it can mean a lot of different things, right? It's pretty vague. It's a short document. I think it's like, 4,000 words or something like that. And there's lots of room for interpretation. And it's one of the reasons as to why it is currently today the longest lasting governing document in the world. It's proved incredibly durable when compared to other countries. Other countries have gone through not just revisions, but scrapping constitutions and rewriting them, to the point where, it's almost unrecognizable. So, it's very important for that particular reason. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but any questions so far about the Constitution? Okay, so we'll just go ahead and continue then. So even after it was written, the Constitution, there was a question about adoption, right? Again, 55 people can write this document, and they did. But the second question is, would the people accept it? Right? Would they accept it? And when the document went out for a vote, essentially what they decided at the convention was that if 9 out of 13 states voted yes on the Constitution, then the Constitution would be ratified. Now, again, in the Articles, there was no provision to allow this process to take place. 9 out of 13 votes were required to pass a law, but in fact, 13 out of 13 was required to revise. But they decided 9 out of 13. And so when the Constitution hit the newspaper, which is how it was disseminated in those days, two camps emerged. Federalists said vote yes on the Constitution. They wrote a series of documents called the Federalist Papers. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison were some of the most important authors. And these documents are perhaps the most important primary source documents that are related to our Constitution today, because they provide a lot more of an insight into what exactly the founding fathers were thinking when they wrote the actual Constitution that governs our country. So For example, during the whole impeachment process for the past 4 or 5 years, a lot of scholars were digging up these Federalist Papers to try and decide, okay, well, what did the founders really mean by impeachment? And are these actions that we've seen in the past 5 years, does that fall under the umbrella? And of course, lawyers just dig through this stuff, especially if you're a lawyer of constitutional law, you will absolutely go through these. The Anti-Federalists said vote no on the Constitution. They said of the Constitution, it was too much power. Of the Federalists, we're going to say Hamilton was the most important one. Of the Anti-Federalists, Thomas Jefferson was the most important one. Saying, look, this is a slippery slope down the path to tyranny. If the government has all of these powers to, for example, tax, which was one thing that the Constitution had the power to do. It had the power to draft an army, had the power to regulate commerce, right? That is to pass tariffs. He said, no, this is just too much power. You had state delegations all over the country debating this, whether or not to pass the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists finally came around and said, look, we'll vote yes on the Constitution if you agree to pass a Bill of Rights. And a Bill of Rights would be a list of protections against we'll call it government tyranny, right? If there's some sort of guarantee that the US government won't cross sort of these lines, right? And of course, we know a little bit about what some of the, maybe we don't, but if you, for example, the First Amendment relates to speech, also relates to press. The Second Amendment is about bearing arms or gun ownership. The Fourth Amendment is the search and seizure, right? Unreasonable search and seizure. Eighth is the one against torture, right? So there was a proposition of various restrictions that Jefferson said, look, if these are included in the Constitution, we'll vote yes. And essentially the Federalists agreed. And so in 1789, the US Constitution was ratified, and a new, I don't know, maybe a new era of American history started with that, right? Now, of course, because the Constitution created the branch of the presidency, George Washington was elected the first president of the US unanimously. There was no question that it was going to be Washington. He was one of those figures who united the country north and south on a lot of different issues. I mean, he was at that point, after the American Revolution, he was like more myth than he was man. The stories about him were, they were tall tales at that point. He was responsible for the continental victory over the British in the American Revolution. So he had all of that military experience. When they finally got around to adding the Bill of Rights, it was only added later. This is why we call them amendments. It's interesting to note that today, if you were to ask somebody, like, what is the Constitution? They would probably tell you something like, well, isn't it like, freedom of speech or something like that? They would actually be describing the Bill of Rights. But in fact, in the, outside of the amendments, an amendment is just a change or an addition, the Constitution originally didn't have a Bill of Rights. It was only included afterwards. There were 10 of them. Again, here are just some examples of what they are. But again, the Bill of Rights is a list of protections against government tyranny. If you actually read the amendments, it says Congress shall pass no law, meaning that, freedom of speech isn't just the ability to be able to say whatever you want. It is the fact that the government shall not pass a law that will infringe on your ability to say whatever you want. that was ratified. So that became part of the Constitution a little bit later. I think 1791 was when that was first ratified. Now, here's the interesting thing about Washington and Washington's presidency, because today we'll be talking about the first two presidents, George Washington and John Adams. George Washington was the first, not just U.S. president, but he was the first president ever. Right? There had never been a president anywhere before George Washington. So a lot of the question was, well, what does the president do? How do they behave? How do you, address the president? All of these things were uncharted territory, essentially. And so one of the reasons why Washington's presidency is so significant is because he's kind of setting a standard by which other presidents will follow. Again, recall the Constitution is not that specific. Like, it doesn't tell you to do, okay, wake up on Monday and do this, right? Wake up on Thursday and do that. It's not specific in terms, it briefly outlines what the purpose of the executive branch is, right? That is to execute the laws, what power the executive branch has. So, for example, the president is the commander-in-chief of all armed forces. But it's not specific in terms of a lot of different things. And so Washington kind of sets the precedent for how a president should conduct themselves, not just as a U.S. president, but really everywhere else. And kind of the best way to think about the president, maybe in the U.S. context, is the president is kind of like a leading citizen. One point that Washington really wanted to make was that he was not a king, because really up until that point, that was kind of the only other type of ruler, king or queen. And so to drive that point home, Washington wore different clothing. They had to decide what the president should officially be called, and there was great debate over that. Federalists who believed that the president should have more power opted for more fancy titles. Anti-Federalists like Thomas Jefferson said, no, the president's no better or worse than any other typical citizen, and you should just be able to call him, anything that you want. And what they decided on for the official term was Mr. President. And that kind of illustrates this idea. You don't call a king Mr., right? Mr. George or whatever it is, George III. A king has all those sort of titles with them, your highness, your royalty, etc., etc. It's respectful, but it's not too respectful, right? And that was kind of finding the right area. One thing that Washington did was he set up his executive department. Sometimes we call this the presidential cabinet. This is kind of like close advisors. So, for example, the Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of State, in those days, the Secretary of War. Washington chose all those members. And in doing so, he actually did something that not all U.S. presidents have done, but certainly those that try to follow in Washington's footsteps have done. And that is to choose people that are best suited for the job, that maybe even disagree with him. So, for example, both Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson were part of Washington's cabinet when these two couldn't be more further apart on the issues. They disagreed more than anything on pretty much everything, right? On pretty much everything. All right, any questions so far? Okay, so now we're entering into this period called the Early Republic. So we have a brand new government, the Constitution, 3 branches. 1789, when George Washington steps foot into office, roughly to about, we'll say, 1815, which is, the end of the War of 1812. And again, the early republic, this is like the earliest years. And if you think about the country developing like a child, as they say, the earliest years are sometimes the most important. They're the time where maybe the country is most impressionable, that they have the, it's kind of like their developmental years, so to speak. And so this was less true during Washington's presidency because Washington had that kind of, he had that ability to unite Americans despite their ideological differences and despite their regional differences. But this was especially true after Washington had left office, and especially true after Washington had died, which was, I believe, 1799. But Americans divided themselves into two groups, right? And to avoid any confusion, let's go back up here. So these two groups right here, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, these were only groups that debated over the Constitution, right? These were groups that debated over the Constitution. Once the Constitution was ratified and signed into law, these groups essentially don't exist anymore. Federalists and Republicans, right? These are political parties, right? Political parties who have different ideas about what the trajectory of the government should be. Many of the Federalists up here became Federalists down here. Many of the Anti-Federalists became Republicans, but they're not exactly the same group. So for example, if we take someone like James Madison, who wrote the Constitution, James Madison was a Federalist here. He said vote yes on the Constitution. You'd hope so because he wrote it. But when it came to political parties, Madison ended up being a Republican. So the Federalists and the Republicans, these are the political parties. We sometimes call this the first party system, right? The first party system. And they had different ideas about how the government ought to work. In terms of Federalists, again, we want to remember that Hamilton is the chief Federalist. In terms of Republican, it's Jefferson, right? When it came to their positions, there's a lot of different positions that each of these parties have, but essentially what it comes down to is that Hamilton wants the national government to have more power. Thomas Jefferson wants the national government to have less power and state governments to have more power. Now, we have to kind of go back and say, okay, well, why did all of this start, right? Why did this recreating of a U.S. Constitution even begin with? And one of the biggest issues was the inability to handle debt, right? War debt. The United States owed money to other countries. They owed money to their own soldiers. There had been Revolutionary War veterans who had fought in the war and had not yet been paid. And so now with the power to tax, which is what the Constitution did, right? The Constitution gave the U.S. government the power to tax. Alexander Hamilton, who was named the Secretary of Treasury, we'll say he is Secretary of Treasury. Alexander Hamilton was given the task to put together an economic plan, right? To save the U.S. economy, because the economy was the most pressing issue in those, at that day. Hamilton's plan consisted of a couple of parts. The most important parts, though, we'll list three here. One was to combine state debts into a national debt. Again, if we look at the issue of debt, all the different states owed money because under the Confederation period, when it came to paying off debt and the ability to raise money to do that, that was only happening at a state level. Hamilton said this is too difficult to manage. Instead of having all the states having their own debts, let's create one single national debt. Hamilton said, too, we need to create a national bank that would create a common currency. It would allow the national government to borrow money so that it could, pay down its obligations. And number three, needed a tax, right? Raise taxes, namely on things like tea and whiskey, right? And these were all part of the plan to solve this economic crisis. Now, Hamilton got a lot of resistance, especially from Thomas Jefferson, who said these things are too much, and in some ways it's like, really seriously, after everything the country went through, you want to tax tea, Alexander Hamilton? Given the history of how the American Revolution started off. Jefferson said that, creating a national bank, there's nowhere in the Constitution which says a national bank can be created. And, this battle between Jefferson and Hamilton back and forth really represented the kind of ideological and constitutional divide. Hamilton was somebody who believed, when looking at the Constitution, that if there was no explicit prohibition of it, then you had the power to do it, right? So, for example, if the Constitution says, like, the First Amendment, you cannot prohibit free speech, well, then you cannot prohibit free speech. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, he believes you can only do something if the Constitution explicitly says that you can do it, right? That is, well, the Constitution gives the U.S. government the power to write taxes, right? Or raise taxes, for example. And so you can see how these two different kind of perspectives clash with each other and continue to clash, right? Those who are strict constitutionalists, you can only do what the Constitution says you can do. And those that like to take a more interpretive approach and say, well, if the Constitution doesn't say you can't do it, well, then you can do it, right? Because there's no explicit sort of prohibition of it. And the idea of the national bank was, was big there. Eventually, the two sides compromised. And this is going to be a theme that we'll talk about all the way up into the Civil War. Because for as divided as American society is, seemingly in the early years, there was always some sort of way for these individuals to find an agreement, right? A middle ground. And the agreement is Hamilton will get his policies, right? So Hamilton gets his plan. The state debts are combined. A new national debt is created. A national bank is created. And taxes go into effect. Well, what does Thomas Jefferson get? Well, he gets the location of the nation's capital. And that is Washington, D.C., which is in Virginia in the South. And that was important because up until that point, the nation had been meeting in New York, and New York was like the financial sector of the country. It was where Wall Street is. And Jefferson's fear was that, well, if members of Congress are having lunch with members of Wall Street, then they will be too easily influenced by the interests of finance, the interests of business, the interests of banking. And instead, if we could actually physically remove the politicians from Wall Street, make them reside in the South, which Virginia was a southern rural state at that time, well, then we could kind of make sure that those two sides are divorced. And just like that, construction for a new nation's capital was made. Interestingly enough, George Washington presided for most of his presidency in New York. And later presidents would move to D.C. Congress would be built in D.C. away from New York. And that was the deal. But again, this led to this opposition between both sides, and that was Federalists and Republicans. Not the same Republicans that we have today, right? Same name. It's, I guess I just like to do that to, torture history students and trying to remember different political parties. But the first party system is, again, Federalists and Republicans. And we should say that Hamilton's plan was actually pretty effective at getting rid of the debt, and economically the nation, really started to pick back up. At the same time, while the economic problem is being handled, there's also a question about U.S. legitimacy. Does anybody actually take this new government seriously? does the own citizens of the US do other foreign countries? And one thing that Washington did during his presidency was to legitimize the US. Now, certainly we're a far ways away from the amount of kind of respect you could say the United States gets today. But certainly in the early years, it was very important for at least other people to recognize that this new government, in fact, resisted. Amongst their own citizens, the Whiskey Rebellion, a rebellion of Pennsylvania farmers refusing to pay Hamilton's tax. In fact, a lot of these farmers would produce whiskey, and according to Alexander Hamilton, there was a new tax on whiskey, and so these farmers simply just refused to pay it, like calling the bluff for the national government. They tarred and feathered tax collectors, chanted no taxation without representation, a lot of the same ideals from the American Revolution. George Washington's response was to march an army of like 15,000 soldiers to crush it. And the Whiskey Rebellion was put down. And again, this made the U.S. legitimate in dealing with rebellion. It's a great compare and contrast between what happened in Shays' Rebellion and what happened here. The inability for the Confederation government to deal with Daniel Shays and the ability for Washington to put down the Whiskey Rebellion, again, made everybody respect the new national government. There was going to be no messing around. Nobody was actually killed in it. Washington and his men marched out there, and by that time, it had completely dissipated. Nobody wanted to essentially fight the national government. Statehood continues. We'll continue to talk about this. New states are admitted. Recall that its population, once the population of a territory gets high enough, then it could apply for statehood. Tennessee, I believe, is the first state that's added, but we won't be talking about every single state that gets added to the US, but just kind of take note that as we continue to talk through these chapters, 13 states turn into 14, turn into 15, turn into 16. Another place in terms of establishing what we might call sovereignty or legitimacy. Again, sovereignty, if you're not familiar with this term, is just pretty much the right to rule, right? To be sovereign means you're independent. You have the right to rule yourself. And in terms of establishing sovereignty, the United States needed also to establish sovereignty with Native Americans, specifically in the West, on what is essentially, and again, what we're going to call U.S. territory. And that was territory that was ceded by the British. Now, there's an argument that you could say, well, this land never really belonged to the British to begin with, to give to the U.S. after the American Revolution, right? That's perfectly fine and perfectly legitimate. But Americans very much viewed it as their territory. And like we talked about last chapter, there was conflicts in places like Ohio, Battle of the Fallen Timbers, Treaty of Greenville, which helped establish a pattern of settlement in those Western territories. But the first approach by this new national government was something that I like to call nation within a nation. And that was the U.S. would deal diplomatically with Native Americans and Native American tribes as sovereign nations and people, right? That is to say, to make treaties with them. In much the same way that the United States would deal with France, kind of the same way that the United States took towards Native Americans in North America. So at the same time, we could say, well, yes, that Native Americans are not Americans, right? They're separate, and the Constitution indicates that. But also that Native Americans are independent, right? That there's a recognition by the national government that when a treaty is signed, that Native Americans have the right to rule their own land. And what this creates, if I draw a very sort of crude illustration of what that kind of looks like the east coast of the US, right? This will be the Mississippi River. And what this creates is kind of this Swiss cheese of sovereignty of nations within a nation. So for example, perhaps down here in the southeast, a tribe like the Cherokee sign a treaty with the US government, making this territory sovereign to the Cherokee. So the United States federal government recognizes that the Cherokee owns that land, that they can make whatever laws and policies and whatever they want in that area. But this is a nation, in this case the Cherokee Nation, surrounded by a nation, the larger nation of the US. And various treaties were signed with various tribes all throughout the United States, right? This kind of gives you this Swiss cheese effect. And this is the kind of earliest policy, if you will, towards diplomacy with indigenous populations living within US borders. We'll talk more about how this changes over time because it does not remain stagnant, but this was the policy under Washington's presidency. Additionally, the United States also wants to establish a sense of sovereignty on the national level. Jay's Treaty and Pinckney's Treaty. Pinckney's Treaty is a treaty with Spain, mostly over Florida. And just the fact that the Spanish were willing to sign a treaty with this brand new country does demonstrate some sort of level of respect, at least in the eyes of Spain. The United States was like a real legitimate country. But in other ways, the United States was not really getting a lot of respect. So one of the major foreign policy crises, we'll talk about this more later, was the French Revolution. And in the French Revolution, Great Britain was at war with France, right? And this roughly stretched from let's see, when did these wars actually start? We'll just say 1789 to about 1815, right? So for like 25 years, Britain and France were at war with each other. Both countries hoped that the United States would join their side. The French hoped that the US would join because it was, of course, France who helped the US in their revolution. The British hoped that the United States would join because, let's be real, Americans are pretty much just British people. They separated politically, but they're like pretty much British. The United States and Washington declared neutrality, said that we wouldn't join either side. And that, of course, had the consequence of just making everybody angry at the US, both the British and the French. But Washington wanted to stay out of the war. Jay's Treaty was a treaty with Britain. Not a very good treaty. It had the adverse effect of making France more angry at the US. I won't talk too much about what it did. But just do take note of that both these treaties together, again, kind of make the US more legitimate. All right, at least in the eyes of foreign nations. All right, any questions so far on Washington's presidency? Okay, so downfall of our Federalists here. So again, remember, Federalists and our Republicans are two political parties. Our Federalists include Hamilton. Washington is a Federalist. John Adams is a Federalist. In terms of our Republicans, mostly we want to know Thomas Jefferson. And in the election of 1796, after George Washington stepped down, he served 2 terms. Well, that's something to take note of. we'll write this right here, Washington, 2 terms. That is to say, he served 8 years as president, then decided to step down, and this was in line with the idea of a president not acting like a king. Washington didn't want to set a precedent for future presidents to follow, that they would serve until they died. He was also in pretty bad health. But, when he left office, that was kind of removing kind of the keystone, which was keeping the country together. And the election of 1796 was the first contested election. Right, the first contested election. And it put Thomas Jefferson and John Adams against each other, right? So John Adams versus Thomas Jefferson. And ultimately, it was John Adams who won, right? So John Adams became the 2nd president of the United States. Also a Federalist, right? So John Adams equals 2nd president. Okay. During Adams' presidency, the United States continued to struggle with France. So in this conflict, in general, the Federalists supported Britain. The Republicans supported France. So when Adams won, a Federalist, this really turned France a lot more against the US. I mean, essentially at that point, right, you consider the fact that the United States, first of all, remained neutral in this war. That's strike 1 for France. Then you count the fact that the US signed a treaty with Great Britain. That's strike 2 with France. Then you consider that John Adams won, who is a Federalist, and the Federalists favor the British. That's strike 3, right? And after strike 3, you're out. And so at that point, the United States' relationship with France had pretty much all but deteriorated. I mean, any goodwill from the Revolutionary era was gone. The best example of this is the Xyz Affair. This was the effort to maybe ask U.S., we'll call them diplomats, for a bribe. And the U.S. refused. So essentially, John Adams knew that it was strike 3 with France. He sent some diplomats over to France, wanting to try and smooth over some of this ill will. And the French demanded that they pay just in order to talk to them. Talk about disrespect. And this is what this cartoon is getting at. In other words, even if the U.S. wants to speak to France, they're going to have to pay some money. The United States refused, left, and this had the effect of a quote-unquote quasi-war, that is an undeclared war. Oops. Undeclared war with France. France didn't invade the U.S. The U.S. didn't invade France. Essentially what this war meant was that if an American ship and a French ship saw each other, out in the seas, they would fire upon each other. And at least in this respect, John Adams was much worse at maintaining neutrality than George Washington was. But it's in the context of this quasi-war that you get the most significant protest during the early Republic period, and a moment where the future of the nation certainly is at risk. Probably the one instance you could look at in the very early years anyways and say, this perhaps could be an issue which leads to the dissolution of what is a very, very young nation. And that was when Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts essentially restrict, we'll say, immigration. That is the alien part, right? So the alien part restricts immigration, gives the president the power to deport people, right? The Sedition Act is probably the more important part. And the Sedition Act, what that essentially did was it restricted, or it made certain, made certain speech illegal, right? That is to say, any speech that was critical of the U.S., or say government, right? And the reason why, okay, so why would Congress pass these two laws? Why would they give John Adams essentially the power to deport anybody who he wants and to put in prison anybody who says something that is critical of the government? Well, again, it was under the guise of the quasi-war. The claim was that there were French immigrants coming into the U.S. threatening to undermine the country, and so therefore John Adams needed the power to deport them. And the Sedition Act said because the country is in a war, it needs to ensure that there's no sort of effort to try and overthrow it from within. This sparked off, especially this part right here, that sparked off huge controversy because the Sedition Act, what does this appear to be a violation of? Exactly, free speech, right? This is a clear violation of the First Amendment. They literally just signed the Bill of Rights. And that's when Thomas Jefferson and James Madison prompted their response to this. So the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were Jefferson's and Madison's objection to what we'll call Alien and Sedition Acts. And in those resolutions, Jefferson and Madison put forward this idea of nullification or nullify. That is the power for a state to cancel a national law. Right? We'll talk more about this a little bit later. But essentially, if we think back, right, we have our national government. Think back to federalism. We have our state government, right? Now, when the national government passes the law, this applies to all the states, right? So we have, Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina, whatever, right? When the national government passes the law, it becomes the law in the land everywhere, right? That's why they call it a national law. Nullification says, look, if there's a law that is in violation of the Constitution, well, we're simply not going to follow that law. In other words, we're going to continue following the laws that we like. It's a fundamental part of this Federalist breakdown. Do states have the power to nullify laws? And this turned into a serious crisis, so much so that Virginia, I know Virginia especially, maybe Kentucky also, but they began to draft and train and prepare their militias, fearing that this could in fact break out into some sort of civil conflict. This is not the last time that we'll talk about nullification. We'll talk about it again. But the crisis was averted in 1800 when Thomas Jefferson became the third president. Now recall, Thomas Jefferson was a Republican. The reason why it's called a revolution is because Jefferson was the first Republican president in what at that time had been pretty much 15 years or so of Federalist rule. So this was a time for Jefferson to come in and kind of bring all these new ideas. Right when he was elected, though, Jefferson, the current president, John Adams, who you see pictured right here, made sure to try and staff the government with as many Federalists as he could, knowing that Thomas Jefferson was going to try to reverse it. So John Marshall is the Federalist Chief Justice. of the Supreme Court. Right? And the midnight appointments, we're going to say these were the Federalists appointed as judges by Adams up until midnight. And in fact, I believe this is true. And just gives you a little bit of an idea of just how divided, this time was, and also gives us a little bit of insight of just how divided it is today. So John Adams wanted to make, the biggest mess for Thomas Jefferson to clean up. He wanted to make sure that Jefferson's life would be incredibly difficult while coming into office, right? Sounds a little bit like deja vu. And so what he did was he appointed as many judges as possible, staying up until midnight on the night that he was set to leave office, to make sure that at least at the very least the judicial branch, right? So if we look at the executive is now controlled by Jefferson, that's Republican. The legislative, that's elected by the people, that was Republican. At least the judicial branch would have as many Federalists in it as possible, so that the Federalists could still exercise some power at the national level. And I believe this is true. It might not be 100% true, so if I'm wrong about this, forgive me. But I believe that the last time that a current president refused to attend the inauguration of an incoming president was John Adams not attending the inauguration of Thomas Jefferson, similar to the way that Donald Trump did not attend the inauguration of Joe Biden. I think those are the only two times that has happened. So anyways,